My name is Gene Park. I'm the director of the Global Policy Institute, and we're really lucky today to be hosting a former alum, Wayne Limburg, who's going to be properly introduced in a moment by one of our students, to discuss careers in intelligence. And oftentimes we've had many people come and talk about jobs as a foreign service officer in the State Department, but today we have the pleasure of talking with someone who took a slightly different track within the State Department. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our students, but I do want to flag that we are on social media and host a lot of events. We did an event on climate change and also foreign interference in US elections, and we have a lot planned for next semester as well. So please read the emails that you get, and also you can follow us on social media. So let me turn it over now to others.
Hey everyone, my name's Anne, and I welcome everyone. And joining us today, we have former director at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and also LMU alum, Dr. Wayne Limburg. Dr. Limburg majored in history while at LMU and went on to get his PhD at Georgetown before joining the U.S. Intelligence Services and earning multiple awards for his work on foreign policy. Today, Dr. Limburg will be talking directly with you guys, and we'll have 10 students who have joined us as panelists and will be able to ask questions directly to Dr. Limburg, but we'll also reserve 30 minutes at the end of the event to answer questions from everyone. So whenever you have questions, you can just go ahead and send them into the chat and we'll go through and look at those.
So to start off, Anne and I are each going to ask a question. And the first one is really incredibly pertinent to this week, and especially to people looking to join the intelligence community. It's been 2 days, as you all know, since the national election, and we still don't have results. President Trump has begun to file lawsuits and demand recounts in several states. What does this uncertainty mean for the future of our country in terms of national security? And how will the intelligence community be impacted depending on who is elected?
Okay. Well, first, let me just say I'm really happy to be here and meeting with all of you. These are the kind of things that I have enjoyed before I'd retired and do even more now. And that was a good question, Veronica. I think probably the first thing is with the big decision, of course, is who's going to get the presidency. It looks like now, I think if I were going to bet, I would say it was Joe Biden, but it will be a different situation than I think some hoped it might be, which was, of course, he would have a Senate majority too. But in any case, we would see within the community some changes. I think in general, it would be going back to a more normal situation. I would be strongly surprised if President Biden did not, within a very short time of taking over of his inauguration, replace the Director of National Intelligence. We've gone through several acting and people in that post since General Clapper resigned about 2 years ago, and who, by the way, I think was probably of the DNIs that we've had was probably the best. I would also expect some changes elsewhere within the community. Head of CIA, Director Haspel, I would think would probably stay on for at least a while, in part, I think, because a new administration, a Biden administration, would want to make the point that he respects and believes that there is value in the professionals being around and doing their job. I think that we would see probably a more rigorous briefing schedule coming back. I think we would see a more rigorous exchange between the White House and the community and his briefers and whatever down the line. I think that would probably be true even in some of the other agencies like state, DHS, whatever. One important thing that I think it would not affect as much of the community or the entire community, but it would be important, is the new executive order that is still hanging that President Trump put out to basically change some of the civil service positions that do fall within the intelligence community and some that don't. And my hunch there, in fact, I'm relatively certain that a Biden administration would revoke that order, and we would return to basically the kind of civil service protections and system that we've enjoyed for 150 years, really since Chester A. Arthur established the modern civil service. So I'll end it there.
Thank you. And then I have one more question before we open it up to the audience. I was just going to ask, with your strong engagement in the U.S. intelligence services and foreign policy, what do you believe to be the biggest takeaway from those experiences? And then how did your career shape your outlook on foreign policy?
Well, I think first there's sort of the practical, I wouldn't even say pragmatic, but just how it should function. It has to be founded with a professional core of people. And here I'm talking, remember when we talk about the intelligence community, it's divided between collectors, operators, and it's also those on the analytical side, where I spent all my career on the analytical side. Although I did come in originally to the CIA through the career trainee program, which was a way in which they recruited both operational types and non-operational types analysts. And I can talk more about that if you like down the line. But nonetheless, I think that the idea that this is a professional core and a sense of professionalism, of duty, integrity, the old cliche, but nonetheless, the ability to speak truth to power. And I think that is one of the most important things that I think kind of came through. The other thing is that you've got to have, the corollary of that, of course, is that you've got to have good people. One of the things that I learned in the intelligence community very early on is that despite the protections that are there, the laws and whatever, remember, well, you won't remember, but I came into the community just within a year before the church investigations started that really did change, I think, the United States popular view of how the community works, some of the problems of the community, some of the missteps of the community. But nonetheless, the thing that a big lesson there was, it ultimately comes down to your people. That can be scary because the chances are, that is, Buffett once said about investing. He said, always invest in a company that someday could be run by complete idiots and you could still make money. Well, in a sense, you've got to be careful about that in bureaucracies as well, because it's very likely that someday it might not be perhaps run by complete idiots, but not the best of people. But nonetheless, you have to continually look for those. And those are basically an idea of, I think, professionalism and personal integrity, with always the idea that whether it's a foreign service job or a civil service job or intelligence services, the key word there is service. And that's service to the American people, service to the truth, and it's service to trying to make the policy as informed and as good as you possibly can. That's it.
Thank you for answering the question. Now we're going to open it up to the panelists. So we're going to keep it as an open discussion. So if any of the panelists want to start with their questions, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Hi, Dr. Lindberg. My name's Emma, and I'm most interested in how you began your career or what sparked your interest in joining the intelligence. And then second part question, how do you expect the US-Russia relations to influence our election this year, if at all?
All right, this is kind of a funny one. Let me just give you a little of my background. I was born, raised, went to high school at El Segundo, just across the airport from the university. So when I was growing up, very little kid, we'd go out for Sunday drives and there'd be the big L on the hill, where now's the LMU, of course, because then it was just Loyola. I went to Loyola because I was very much influenced by a high school teacher and some others who had, one, in this case, the teacher went to Loyola, others had gone to other Jesuit schools, and I rather liked that, despite the fact that I was non-Catholic. was one of the few at the time. How did I get into this thing I did? Well, I would always loved history. I was planning to be a history teacher, academic. I was at Loyola about a year or two when Tony Turhallow, who was head of the department at the time, he just said, well, you're going to go on and get a PhD. And I said, really? And he said, oh yeah, that's a given. And so that started that. And then in about it's probably about, I was looking, where was I going to specialize in? And I was looking around, and I've always kind of liked crazies to some degree. And so at one point I thought, gee, maybe I do something with the American Indians, the American West. And then I looked into, some others. And finally, I was very much influenced by Russian literature in the men's chorus at Loyola, the Russian music. And then I made a fatal mistake one day. I went down to the old, and I don't know if it's still there, but the old Loyola movie theater in Westchester on the corner of Manchester and Sepulveda, I think, or whatever. And I went in and I saw Dr. Zhivago. And I came out and I said, boy, that's kind of what I want to do. These guys are really crazy. And so at that point, I started as an undergraduate doing some coursework in Russian history, Byzantine history, and some language work. I'd always wish I had done more language, and then began applying to schools that had Russian history programs. And still thinking I was going to probably be an academic. I got into several, but I had always wanted to get out of Southern California. I felt it would be a good growth thing to go to the East Coast. I wanted to get there, and the best school that I could get into, and also would give me a fellowship and help me pay the way, was Georgetown, and that's what I did. While at Georgetown, it became increasingly clear, this is in the late 60s, academic jobs were beginning to kind of dry up. I had to look around for other things. One of my professors, in fact, the professor that I was his teaching assistant, had been retired Navy. He'd been in Navy intelligence and Defense Intelligence Agency and whatever. He said, you might want to look into intelligence career. And so I said, well, okay, but how do I do that? And he said, if you're going to do it, he said, you probably ought to look into CIA, because they are of the ones that are sort of open to outsiders. And I can explain that in a little bit. CIA is probably the most logical one and probably the best one. And that's what I did. Eventually coming into the agency in late 1973. I worked at the agency for 5 years, and then we had a program at that time in which we young analysts had the opportunity to go spend a year at State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which I did. I liked it well enough there that basically I decided to stay and transferred over and started my work then at INR. In the intervening years, I went back to CIA for a while and then back to INR. Early 2000s, 2005, I went and worked 6 months at the Director of National Intelligence Office as the state representative on the Presidential Daily Brief staff, and a year at the War College back in the 90s, whatever, but largely from about 1980 on, pretty much the entire time at state INR. That answer it?
Great, thank you.
So anyone have any other questions? I know everyone prepared questions, so whoever wants to ask.
Let me just expand a little bit, though. I kind of dodged over it because I wanted to make a point about where state INR kind of fits into the community. And it's usually referred to as one of the elder sisters because it was one of the first, though the smallest, and it's always been the smallest, one of the first members of the community. It was founded really back right after World War II, we sort of inherited all of the analytical resources, files, and a lot of the analysts who had worked for the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, during the war. At the end of the war, they said, we have these resources, human and otherwise, that are very important. We don't want to lose them, but where are we going to put it? Well, CIA wasn't even up and running at this point. So they said, well, let's transfer it over to state. That would make it logical, created an office and then ultimately a Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And that's how it sort of started. The Bureau was always, as I said, and still is, relatively small. We seldom were over 300. To give you an idea of what that means, we had 300 analysts, that included 300 employees, that includes secretaries, security people, now IT and other support, executive officers, whatever, about 180 analysts at any one time covering the waterfront, the world. Again, to give you an idea what that means, that's not even the size of one office, analytical office at CIA. An average CIA office is probably closer to 300. So, we were always might have been one of the older sisters, but we were also one of the smallest, particularly then after DIA got up and running in the 1960s. To get into INR, we occasionally hired directly, new people out of grad school or whatever. But in general, because we were so small, and we were civil service, by and large, about 2-to-1 civil service to foreign service officers. We wanted sure bets when we hired. So we would take people like myself on loan. If it worked out, we fit in, we did the job that they wanted, they were doing. There might well, and there was an opening, then that would be the way you'd make it in. Or if we had an opening and we wanted to fill it, we might go out and, quite frankly, poach in the rest of the community. If we knew there were some good people out there, we would ask them, do you want to come over? It was a small, it's always been small. And one of the reasons why I stayed at INR is, quite frankly, I found that I really liked the smaller organization, more responsibility at a younger age, and always I had the feeling that you were more a part of it all the time and closer to the policymaker and the decision maker.
So I know Azalea, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but I know you want to speak next. Also, if anyone wants to raise their hand, that way we can have an order for people speaking. I know that that's an option on Zoom, but go ahead.
My name is Azalea. I just was wondering what advice you would give to a college senior who is thinking of joining the intelligence community, especially with everything that's happening right now. What advice would you give us?
It's not an easy time. I'll be quite honest. There are a lot of pressures on the community, especially, and a lot is going to depend on how the election comes out. Frankly, if we see a Biden victory, I think many of the bad pressures, if you will, are probably going to evaporate. And as I said earlier, we will probably go back to a more normal way. That's not to say that their pressures aren't there even in normal times. There is always this idea that on the intelligence side, we try as best we can to create a firewall between the policymaker and the intelligence so that the intelligence process is not politicized. At the department, at INR, we used to have a phrase in which we said, look, we are part of the department. Absolutely. We are an intelligence organization that is embedded in a policy organization. So we are embedded in the State Department, but we're not in bed with the policymakers. We keep and I think we have always done a very good job at that. And having been at CIA back in the 80s when there was probably it may have been up until quite recently the worst examples of politicization that certainly I saw in my 40 years. I knew what it was about, and it was another reason why I went over. I returned to state. I remember one afternoon I was going, or evening I was going out the building, and the head of my bureau, Ambassador Abramowitz, who's one of the greats in my career, turned to me and he said, "So why'd you come over here? I mean, geez, you could probably get more promotions, at CIA, and what drove you to make that choice, to kind of even choose a slower track?" Well, I turned to Morton. By that time, we had gotten to know each other pretty well, and I knew we both had somewhat salty vocabularies. And I said, "Well, Mort," I said, "when it comes right down to it, I know I could tell you you're full of shit and you wouldn't fire me." And he laughed and he said, "Yeah, that's right." He said, "But don't do it." Okay. Okay. Now, how you go about it or what you want to do as a student, I think that's a great question. First, you've got to be thinking of grad school, with one exception, and I'll get to in a minute. And if I don't, remind me. And it's through the Foreign Service. But nonetheless, you really do need an advanced degree. I don't think you need a doctorate. In fact, for some time now, when people have asked me that, should I get a doctorate? I've always said, look, if you want a doctorate and you really want to do it, that's important to you. You want to do the research and whatever, then go do it. But don't get it with the idea that it's a union card, a ticket that gets punched and then has certain guarantees, because you're going to be unhappy. It's probably not going to, work out. Also, as in everything else, be flexible, and also be open to other alternatives that maybe didn't even occur to you. Mentor, colleague, Ambassador Abramowitz once told me, he said, "Look, Wayne," he said, "don't plan more than 2 years in advance," because he said other things are going to happen that can completely change for the better or the worse. But he said, it's probably, have a life plan, have goals, but don't be wedded too hard to anything for more than about 2-3 years. Now, he was saying that because he was a Foreign Service officer and his career worked in 2-3 year cycles, which I think you've probably heard from other speakers. I would recommend, if you are looking into a graduate school and I was always happy. I mean, I was always happy with my degree and work in history. Others I know that did international relations, poli-sci, but there's also public policy schools like Johns Hopkins and elsewhere. I would say that you might want to think about if you're serious about it, getting out of Southern California for that grad experience, finding somewhere to kind of broaden it. Don't be afraid of a foreign university, especially if you have the language skills. As a student now, and you're thinking about it, if you already have some language skills, further work on those and maybe think of another one. That would be, another good course. When you're looking at the grad school too, I'd say, see if you can find one that is connected to the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. This is a program that places fellows government-wide. I mean, from agriculture to state to Homeland Security, whatever. And it's a very good entree because, and it's one way we, in my old office, we began to depend on it and use it quite a bit for the last 20 years to recruit some of our younger new analysts, because it's a rigorous program. They've already been, if you will, vetted. You've already been, looked into, and in some cases, we even know that they've got a very good chance in terms of security clearances and other things. It makes it easier. So I would recommend that. And the other thing is, again, stay open. Now, two other possibilities. If you're an ROTC, and you go into your first your first career, I mean, into the Army, Navy, whatever, into the service, look into there and look into intelligence, especially. The advantage there is that you could well get your then master's and paid for and more and other experience. You'd be working in intelligence, and then you could either stay in the military or go to DIA or go to CIA. You'd have a leg up. The other way, and this is done, is, and I encourage people to do it, is think seriously about the Foreign Service exam. And that you can take, and it's not a bad idea to take it, right, even as a senior in college, but certainly right after you graduate. You don't need a master's, let alone a PhD or a law degree or whatever, although it's nice to have any of those, to take the exam. And if you finish the exam and then go through the review boards and whatever, you can enter, with simply your bachelor's. And then later they will also begin to provide training opportunities, whatever. And once there, you can then do a tour in INR and see if you like it. Meantime, first tour, you're probably going to be in some place like Kingston or Juarez or whatever. You're going to be stamping visas. It's not the most exciting stuff. If you have the certain language skills, Russian, your first posting might be the consulate in Moscow stamping visas. But if you've got Chinese or Arabic or whatever, that would make a difference as well. There's a little bit of an initiation process going on there. They want you to, but it's not a bad one, because consular act duties are very key to what embassies do, and you're earning your spurs. That help?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Dr. Lindberg. My question actually goes off of the previous question. And given that a lot of students are going through a really stressful time, and I'm sure your career has had a lot of stressful moments, how do you manage stress in the work that you do?
Yeah. Not as well as I'd like to at times. Okay, I'm going to tell another war story, and forgive me, this will give you the bad example. In the old days, this is back in the 80s, we were still using typewriters. We were still using carbon paper, the department had a thing you could not use a Xerox unless you had to justify it. It was kind of crazy. And I remember one time I was working with an old Remington upright typewriter, clacketa, clacketa, clacketa. And which, by the way, one of the best skills I ever learned, it was in high school, was typing, because that got me in, did more for me probably than a lot of other things I did. But anyway, I was working on it, and that damn machine just wouldn't work. I had a hard deadline. It was, I was going crazy. I was young. Well, at the end of the morning of the day, the typewriter was no longer on my desk. It was sticking in a hole in the wall that had been created by my anger. The great thing is that when the typewriter technicians came in to repair it, and it was funny because as I talked to them, it turned out they were Afghan refugees. This was after the Soviet invasion. They came in and they looked at it and they said, "Oh, Mr. Lindberg, it looks like this was dropped." And I said, "No, it was thrown." And I had suddenly had great respect. They said, "This is somebody we don't mess with." Okay, that's a silly story, and it's the wrong way to deal with the stress. The best way is you've got to back up. You've got to recognize that you can't get everything done. You're going to hit bad patches. More importantly, I think it's very important that you have a life outside, that there are other things that are driving you that you love to do, whether it's music, whether it's family, and I encourage the family. Although you had to talk to my family whether they thought it was always a good idea. There is, theater, movies. I know for the last 20 years, or the last 20 years of my career, the reason why I was able to continue and do it and keep, quite frankly, my sanity and probably my marriage and kids talking to me and everything else, although by that time they were grown, is what I did is I became a trail maintainer with the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club. And so every month, at least once weekend a month, I'd go up into Shenandoah National Park and work on my trail, digging in the dirt, moving rocks, cutting trees, and I used to joke, even, and it was a joke even around the office, my office, is that given all of my, what other accomplishment or degrees and whatever, one of the ones that I was proudest of is I was a certified chainsawer in the National Park Service. So, I mean, it's that kind of thing I think that you have to develop. There's a world outside. It cannot be, and you're going to then be able to bring more to the job as well. To wit, I had a great time and developed a really good friendship with a Finnish colleague, because when he was home in Helsinki, he used to go out in the woods with his chainsaw too. So it's, again, getting things in common. But the most important thing there, I think, is establishing a sense of perspective. Don't throw things through walls. Instead, calm down, maybe take a walk and come back and find other ways to deal with the stress.
Thank you.
I have a question, Dr. Lindberg. Hi, my name is Christina.
Hi, Christina.
You spoke about the Foreign Service. I have a question. How has the role of the embassies and foreign postings evolved in the past couple of years with an expanding cyber world and satellite technology? So besides the main function of visas and, getting our spurs, as you talked about, what does a diplomatic position look like currently?
Well, I'm going to address that in a sense from the intelligence side. Okay. Obviously and I'm sure other speakers have probably developed or will this. You are, as a foreign service officer in an embassy, you are representing the United States. And the idea is to represent it and serve US interests abroad. On the consular side, a lot of that has to do with helping businesses, economic, financial, whatever, getting them in contact, getting them the necessary paperwork that they need, protecting them, whatever. On the political side, on the embassy side, it's a matter of making the point of what US interests, what is policy, and trying to further it. On the intel side, the embassies are, very, very important on two levels. First, for those of us at home, one of our big jobs in the community is to be sure that we are getting the kind of resources that can help the embassies do their job. And also we can turn to the embassies and say, we need this kind of information, whatever, to help us do ours. Embassy reporting, by and large, of certainly the classified information, is the lowest classification. It's usually the vast number of embassy reports come out at the confidential, sometimes confidential, no foreign, but generally vanilla confidential, which is the lowest of the formally classified reporting. But it is sometimes and usually one of the most foundational sources or streams of reporting, and some of the best, because who you're talking when they report a conversation. Who's talking. It isn't a unidentified source, as you will sometimes find in CIA, almost all the time in CIA reporting. So you've got that. There's a certain richness to it. Now, do you have to factor in the fact that this reporting is coming from someone who knows he's talking to a U.S. official, and that that's being reported back, and that he's got an axe to grind or a point to make too. Sure, of course, you know. But that's, you know, that's part of the game. That's what you factor in. You factor that in, by the way, in all other reporting too, with some of the exception of some of the highly classified stuff that comes from places like National Security Agency. You know, so you're always factoring it in. It's always a political game. An example, I used to tell an old boss of mine taught me this, and I always passed it along. When we got CIA reports, CIA reports would usually start, give you the title, and then there'd be the source description, and then you'd go into what the actual source was saying, and it would say, you know, is the source reliable? Is it da 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 da? And it's an arcane science, because the words sometimes don't mean what you think they would mean. A reliable source isn't telling you the truth necessarily, or isn't giving you ground zero truth. What a reliable source is, or someone you call reliable as a source, means he's giving you what he thinks is reliable information. He's not trying to dissemble, okay? And you test that over time. Okay, so that's part of it. But anyway, when you would read these, what I would always do is I would never read the source description. I would read the content of the report and say, well, does that make sense? Does that kind of go with what we thought we knew or what we would expect? You know, now sometimes, of course, it can be a big surprise because you can get revelations, absolutely. But does that make sense? Then how does that fit with what we know? Where do we think it's going? Is there a logic to it? Then I would go back and read the source report. I mean, the source description. You know, is he reliable? Is he not? Is he new? Whatever. Because you just don't know. Sometimes a new source can be that. It's new and it's good. An old one can be old and reliable, but he's just reporting what he heard. And also we know that many times, especially on the clandestine side, government, and also in diplomatic reporting, governments coordinate their release of intelligence to us. So suddenly you hear nothing about topic X, okay? And then all of a sudden you've got 4 reports, 2 embassy cables and 2 clandestine, you know. And maybe a defense attaché report telling you all the same thing. If you know the country and you know the reporting patterns and you kind of know, you look at that and you say, okay, they want us to know this. They're sending us a message. We're being told this. And that's not a bad thing. You know, it's not a bad thing. Now, on the one thing that has changed over the years, it's really kind of, it's a good thing, is we now have much greater connectivity to the embassies. In the old days, if we wanted to try and get some, you know, task or whatever, we would have to send a cable. There'd be the delay, the lag, whatever. Now, certainly within the department, if you're at INR, and you see a cable and you say, gosh, that was really an interesting conversation, but what wasn't said? Or did he say something about this, the source? You can just send an email to the person who you know, usually, to the person at the embassy and said, hey, you know, Susan, you just talked to this deputy minister and this is what they said. What did they say anything about this? And they can, or look, and if they didn't, or the next time, are you going to be seeing them at somewhere else? Do you have another appointment or whatever? Could you raise this? And that's been very, very useful. Because then they can come back and say, nah, or you can go to the officer, the Foreign Service officer at the embassy and say, you know, I got this idea. What about this? Does this sound screwy? What are you hearing on the street? And you know, it's an interactive, it's an iterative thing, because that's what the process is about. There's never any final answers and conclusions. You know, it's always, you're always working the problem, trying to figure out where you are and where it might be going.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Dr.
Hi,
Lindberg. Oh, go ahead, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Dr. Lindberg. My question is, the COVID-19 global pandemic has forced me to reevaluate my life goals. So while I desire to be a lawyer, I have started to feel that my work is needed in a more essential way. As a public servant yourself, what makes public service a necessity, and what are the benefits of working for the system?
Okay, that's a good question. And but first, let me say that go to law school. Anyway, because you'd be surprised how many people within the intelligence community, within the foreign service, are lawyers, and other degree. At one point when I was with CIA, back in the mid '80s, I was out recruiting at times for people, new people. And at one point I was down in North Carolina, went to Duke, Chapel Hill, NC State, and we were trying to get engineers. Why? Well, because some of the things that the intelligence community does, satellites, example, whatever, are high, need qualified engineers, not necessarily to design, but to make sure that the designers are giving you what you want and what you need. So as program officers. And so we were looking for engineers. We didn't have much luck because we weren't coming anywhere close to the market in terms of salary. Now, what you can have, though, and that's also true, by the way, with lawyers within the government, as you were saying, if you went into as a foreign service officer or say went to work for CIA or whatever. However, but because then you would be, your degrees might help get you in, but they really aren't going to be making the difference. You're going to be working as an intelligence analyst or whatever. The service, what does it mean? Okay. Of all the awards I ever got, and I had a few, the one I really liked was when I retired, I was given my bureau's Centurion Award. Okay. It was called Centurion after the Roman soldier, the Roman, commander of 100. And the idea is the award went to someone who had a long career, had supposedly met certain bases of excellence as an analyst, manager, integrity, honesty, diligence, dependability, that sort of thing. I don't know if I met half of those, but nonetheless, they gave it to me. But the reason why the idea for the award came from an old quote by a Roman historian in about, I think it was probably 2nd or 3rd century. Anyway, and it was, emperors come and go. And I think this is particularly relevant this week. Emperors come and go. But the empire, Rome, survives or lasts because of the centurions. And that's, to be the centurion, to be the keeper, to be, and as I said earlier, the key word in there, whether it's civil service, foreign service, military service, is service. And I think that brings back, for all the frustrations I had, and there were many, as I told you the story about the typewriter. We eventually, by the way, did get electric typewriters and then finally computers. So that wasn't bad. For all of that, for the sometimes long hours, the feeling that, and I think increasingly, and this is where I am concerned about where government service in general is going, but also particularly in the intelligence services, the lack of appreciation or respect by many of your consumers, by many of the top level, but I think it's a matter that, as my wife always reminded me, and still does, is that it's not those big things. It's not the big deals. It's the everyday. It is the getting up, putting on your clothes, going to the office and doing the best job you can. And knowing that in some way, small way maybe, and sometimes that's the luck of the draw as to what your account is, what you're doing, you are making a difference. Now, as far as the other though, practical, it's not a bad living. The pay's not bad. Washington is a nice place, except in the worst part of summer. But right now, it's beautiful out there. The leaves have changed. It's whatever. It's an expensive place. But then again, if you're coming from Southern California, it's a wash. So you're kind of used to it. There's the travel, absolutely. There's the things that are new. It's the ability also that I was always amazed of bringing all sorts of things to the job, that you had learned and you thought, gee, what am I ever going to do with this? And lo and behold, years later, you think, oh, gee, that does have some relevance, or I can use that, whatever. So again, I still encourage people to consider, a career in government, federal, state, and local for that matter. Because I'm glad I did it. I made the right choices on that. But again, it comes with some price and some and frustrations. Does that help, Margaret?
Yes, it definitely does. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Lindberg. My question is that, and it ties a little bit into one of the points you previously addressed. With reports that the intelligence community under Trump had started amending certain documents, dossiers, and briefings, and at times even blowing up certain topics out of proportion, what are some of your foremost concerns over that happening in a presidential administration period?
Oh, it was always a concern. It was always, you always had to, and it was a tension, okay? There was a tension there. Because one of the things we always recognized, and we always had to kind of, especially new analysts and whatever, is know your audience. Like in any, whether you're arguing a case in court, whether you're writing, a story, whatever. Know your audience. It probably doesn't. It's not a good idea to insult your audience, if you can, One of my favorite stories, what came from, this is way back, even before my time, but one of my, we had a senior official come in, and he was getting a briefing, and he said, and again, you'll see that this might well have been a political appointee or somebody without maybe, the greatest experience, because you'll see from his question. And so he's getting a briefing on Egypt. And the question comes up, he then steps back and he says, oh, Egypt. He said, that's landlocked country, isn't it? And the analyst, an old friend of mine, said, yes, sir, on 3 sides, sir. And proceeded then with the briefing. Okay, my point there is that you've got one is that many times you might be the smartest person in the room. I always recommended to my analysts and tried to follow it myself, but don't expect it and don't think you are, and don't act like you are. Your job in a lot of ways was to be an educator, and bring along your audience and begin to develop. And you're not going to do it all in once. It was, as I mentioned earlier, it's an iterative. We used to have in the Bureau an idea that we would come in, and if we had a topic, and this used to drive me, as a manager, it would drive me crazy, because I'd go and ask an analyst, you want to do a piece on this? And they said, no, I just did one last week. I said, yeah, well, that was last week. Let's do it this week. And it went back to when I was the analyst covering Soviet Middle East during the Iranian Revolution. And I was being asked, when I was at State at the time, I was being asked every week, at least once a week, if not twice, I had to do for our daily publication a piece on what the Soviets are thinking about the Shah of Iran and Iran, the revolution, 78, 79. And I would, of course, I would say the same thing as my analyst did, you know, say, hey, wait a minute, I just did that on Monday. It's Thursday, come on. And they said, no, we got to do it. We got to keep doing it. To the degree that I actually created a template, because the story was the same. The facts and the reporting you'd plug in were different, but the general gist was the same. I actually created a template in which the opening paragraph had, last week, and then there you choose 3 or 4 in each space in the sentence, adjectives, adverbs, verbs, whatever, and you could just shuffle them so that you could never quite say the same thing. It worked fairly well, but that was kind of rare. More importantly but our idea was that we used to say, and I still believe it, is that, look, you go in and you tell them something, and the first time, very likely your policymaker, who is really busy, and also let me say, and the really good policymakers, and I had the pleasure of working for and with quite a few of them, they many times are way ahead of you in the analysis. They even, they're as comfortable as you are. And one of the reasons they're looking to you for analysis is in some ways to either give them something that they didn't think of, or to confirm what they were thinking, And so that's, or give them a report that they can use in the policy and bureaucratic debates and struggles that they're using. Okay, it can be a weapon. But in any case, you go in the first time and tell them, well, this is how it is. And many times the reaction would be, why are you telling me this? I don't need it. What is this? What are you bothering me? Second time, the next week, you'd go in and you'd give it to them again, same basic message. And they'd say, oh, yeah, I'd heard something about that, and they'd read it, maybe say, okay, yeah. The third time you'd go in and they'd say, what are you telling me about this? You're wasting my time. I know this. Well, that means that you did your job. The other side of that was the old story used to be with Henry Kissinger, is that if it was something he didn't know, but he realized he needed to know, he'd read 40, 50 pages at one sitting, and that's it. If it was something that he knew, he had no time. I mean, and you were telling him what he already knew, then you'd be shown the door. But the problem there is that when it's one thing that everybody has preconceived notions. I mean, one of the things we once did with the CIA they did some really interesting work on the psychology of analysis, and how we do things. And they found that most of us form our opinions with 3 pieces of data on anything. That's buying a car, getting married, taking a course, 3 pieces of data. And the funny thing is, those pieces of data don't have to even fit together. They can be contradictory, whatever, but it's usually the first 3 pieces of data you see are going to begin to form your opinion. Every subsequent piece of data that you get, evidence, reporting, whatever, that comes in, you're going to fit into that model you had created based on the first 3. Okay. Knowing that, if you will, think about it, it explains a lot about, including this week, how people vote. But knowing that, a good analyst will then step back and say, wait a minute, am I falling into that trap? This is different. And should I judge this independently? Should I worry, not even if, how should I approach this and how can I do this? And that was sometimes the jobs we would do, particularly informally, morning briefings of assistant secretaries, whatever. The good ones always appreciate it. They would say, "Oh, I got this." Da 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 da. You say, "Yeah, Dan, I understand that," and you're right. I mean, that's kind of. But have you thought of this? And then you'd see later, maybe during the day or maybe a week later, you got the resonance. It came, and what you said, did you think of this, might have been wrong, by the way, but at least it opened it up, and I think helped prevent that. And also it worked also against the whole notion of groupthink, which of course we have quite often. My bureau was always known as the great dissenter. I mean, we probably took more footnotes and dissents on estimates and whatever than anybody else, probably more than everybody else combined, because we were a little contrarian. And I think that was healthy. It sometimes got us into trouble.
Thank you so much.
So I think Cassandra, you had a question?
Yes, afternoon, Dr. Lindberg. Thank you for being with us today. My question is, the current state of politics reflects an increased presence of foreign actors within our domestic political process and presents unprecedented challenges for future leaders. How would you suggest young people get more involved in understanding foreign affairs before attempting a career in public service?
Yeah, also this picks up on a question that I had earlier that I think I kind of didn't get to about foreign interference in the election. So good, thanks. Well, read. Go to things like the GPI sessions. Be an avid, hungry reader and searcher, for information. It's kind of, I know it sounds sort of almost cliche-ish, or kind of basic, but it's true. That's the most important. The best analysts that I've known, and the best practitioners also, generally were voracious, not necessarily readers. Not everybody, learns, but they were voracious accumulators of information and facts, data, opinions. They also, of course, I think, were people watchers. And in the sense that there is a certain social side of this, getting along, not so much getting along. We used to have a thing that, look, the kind of person we hired, do we always want to hire a genius? No, probably not. The person we really want to hire is the person that you could spend. We had the submarine rule that if you had to spend 6 months in a submarine with them, could you do it? Now, they still have to be smart enough to do their job and whatever, but many times we found that it was the personality, the emotional side counted as much as the intellectual. Critical thinking, develop that, work at it. It was, again, I think it was one of the things that when I was at Loyola was one of the most important things I took away. It was always a matter of sort of prove it, make your case. Another thing, by the way, is that I think skill level is certainly just basic communication skills. Oral, because as I said, not everybody is a great reader. Many of the best policymakers I saw were basically oral. They just preferred it that way. They took it in more that way. And that sometimes was hard because you didn't always have the time. The two most recent and best examples of that were W, who he liked his oral briefings. He liked to sit, his presidential daily brief was basically done orally every morning. And he liked to sit there and chat with the briefer, and he interjects stuff. He wouldn't let other people do that, by the way, because he said, I know what you guys are trying to do. You're trying to use this to convince me about something else, a policy issue, or get on my schedule, get my face. No, he wouldn't allow that. He said, this is with my briefer. You guys can sit around and listen in, and I might turn and say, gee, that was an interesting thing. Let's look into that some more as far as policy or whatever. Obama was basically just the opposite. Obama he didn't even have the session in the Oval Office every morning with his brief. He would come in, and by that time we had gotten to the point we were delivering it, the presidential daily brief on tablet, he would take it and he'd just walk into his office, shut the door. He'd read the morning take, prepared, finished intelligence. Maybe a few, as he was walking in, the DNI might say, oh, by the way, we have some other reporting here you should be aware of, and give him a quick line or two, or even the report maybe to read. That was rare. He would go in, he'd read it, he'd come out, hand it back and say, thank you. And then the DNI, any questions, sir? And usually he'd have a few, but that was the way he liked to do it. And again, it was his style. And I wouldn't say, I can't honestly say one's better or worse than the other. I can certainly say that that's not the style it's currently being done in the White House. In fact, style currently might be too big a word, or too good a word to use. But I'm showing my prejudices.
On that note, I think we're going to move into our Q&A section of the night. I want to remind of the day, not the night. During pandemics, you can never tell. So I want to remind everyone to please submit questions in the chat if you have any questions that you want to ask. The first question that we have is from Josh, who had to leave early, unfortunately, because he had a class, but is going to be listening to this later. And he is asking, what's the most important thing that you learned while working at the State Department? And what was your favorite memory or favorite project that you worked on?
I guess probably the most important thing I learned is that when it absolutely comes down to it, it comes down to you. It comes down to your sense of values. It comes down to your sense of integrity, of service. Nobody else is going to be able to fill that in. And I think a corollary to that is that as far as the satisfaction, it's what you're going to take away from it. You can't expect that you're going to get a pat on the head and an attaboy, whatever. Although the attaboys, if I can just interject, Richard Armitage, when he was Powell's deputy at the department, had a great comment, and that was 10 attaboys, or pats on the back, do not cancel out one oh shit. So, I mean, that was the other thing to kind of keep in mind. As far as the one, I'm glad this, and I'm really glad this came up. The one thing, the one event or project, let's put it that way. I think for me, the most exciting and interesting was, of course, the breakup, was the Reagan-Gorbachev partnership in the last half, the development of that in the early 80s, and then leading into the late 80s, and finally then, of course, the end of the Cold War, and ultimately fall of the Soviet Union. Those were, that if that was a project, the thing that we did at that point that I'm probably the proudest of, or certainly, and it was hard, a lot of work, is my office, my team, we created for every ministerial, that's a meeting between the Secretary of State and, in this case, Shevardnadze, in most of that period, and summit between the two presidents, Gorbachev and Reagan, and then later Bush Sr. and Secretary Baker. By the way, there's, I think, a very good book out. Somebody was asking about one thing I would recommend reading. There's two good books out. One would be the new biography on Baker, the most powerful man in Washington, whatever. It's quite good. But in any case, what we would do for each one of those meetings is what we called a red team. It was an idea we had come up with, in which we said, look, we know to prepare for these meetings, and this, by the way, is also something else that's gone by the boards, which I think is regrettable, to report it was an enormous amount of work to prepare for a ministerial order summit. I mean, it was weeks, months, in which paperwork, volumes were created about and refining on our policy, our arguments, getting the participants up to speed, you know, and really getting them. We decided at one point, well, I wonder if the Soviets in this case are doing the same thing. Why don't we see if we can write a memo or a book that would be the equivalent of what we're doing for, say, President Reagan? What would Gorbachev's look like? Well, we played around with that for a while, but as it turned out, for each one of those meetings, we created what we called a red team memo, in which it was relatively short, not even half a dozen pages, usually closer to 4, in which we would lay out what we think the Soviets, Gorbachev was going to come in with to the meeting, what were going to be his requests, his demands, his positions, his pushback, what was driving these at home, and whatever. I think that was probably some of my proudest work, because we know that the secretary, George Shultz, then Baker, and we know the president saw them a couple times. We even saw echoes in presidential comments from our red teams. And we would get them back. They'd be marked up, highlighted, you know, whatever. And in fact, they were so popular that at the end there for Baker, we were writing 2. We would write one about a month or 2 before the meeting, and then another one just a week before. And he would use it, we found out later, as sort of a aide memoir. Just before he went in, he'd look at this saying, yeah. One of the more fun ones we did was when Powell, who in some cases was perhaps the most accessible secretary we ever had, or at least not that I knew. He would come when he was meeting, one of his first meetings with the Russian foreign minister, as newly created Secretary of State under W. We knew that he always went in with a little 4x6 card, and he had just little slugs typed or handwritten, and it was just help his memory. You know, he said, "Oh yeah, I got to do that, got to do that, got to do that. You know, these are the points I make. This is my agenda. This is what I want to do." Okay. So what we did on that one is we created a 4x6 card that we think the Russian foreign minister would take into that meeting. And it was a real fight getting it up the line, as we call it, through all the bureaucracy and levels of review, because a lot of people said, "Oh, no, this is kind of frivolous. You know, this is kind of, come on," you know, and we kept saying, "No, let's try it. What's it going to hurt? We know that Powell is a mensch. He's got a good sense of humor. You know, nobody's going to get fired here." It finally got up to the last draw, and they was looked at. And fortunately, the person making that call was an old colleague and a fellow student when I was at the War College. And they looked down and they saw it was coming out of my shop. And they said, "Oh, yeah." She said, "Yeah, let's go ahead. I kind of like it." Sent it in. It was a real hit. Powell liked it, and sent it back with a little handwritten note, which we very seldom get. And that gets back to, you know, you do your job and don't worry about the attaboys. And just said, you know, "Great, thanks." You know, and we never did another one of those, by the way, because sometimes you get one shot at that kind of thing, and that's it.
Great. We have another question that came in from the audience, which asks, what kinds of people are intelligence agencies looking for? You know, how do you get in the door, especially in light of all of the changes to the administration that have been going on during the Trump administration, all these resignations going on? How do people actually get involved?
Well, the process, of course, CIA, I have not seen them recruiting heavily lately, but about couple 3 years, well, yeah, probably about 4 years ago now. No, 2, 3. They were, I mean, you couldn't go down to the Foggy Bottom metro stop any day without seeing great big signs saying, you know, think about CIA, whatever. And you of course can go onto their website and see. That's the practical way. And of course, as I mentioned, if you're looking at state, you're probably looking at the Foreign Service exam. However, one of the problems, and this is going to be, it goes back to one of the first questions, one of the big changes I think we can see if we see a change in administrations is under Trump, there has not been a class of Foreign Service officers coming in for several years now. And that is not a good thing, because usually it would be 100, 150, max maybe 300. They might have 2-3 classes every year that would come in, but you need that to constantly regenerate and grow. At the top, this might be good news for the younger of you. At the top, what happened early on in the Trump administration is we saw an exodus, sometimes by choice, sometimes not, of senior Foreign Service officers, diplomats, and officials. And that, of course, was, you know, brain drain and loss of enormous resources. It's going to be very interesting to see if indeed we have a new administration, what they do to try and reverse that, whether they go back and get some of the people that left in the early days of the Trump administration and bring them back in to the department and other policy positions. And then, of course, I don't have to mention some of the other casualties that we've seen. The Vindeman, Trill Vindeman, Masha Yovanovitch, an old friend, who during the impeachment, but others have hung on, and they're still there. But I think that's, when you're thinking of that, that's sort of the actual process. And so I think there may well be opportunities. Now, I don't know. Am I answering that question properly?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. As you notice, I wander a bit.
No worries. That's what we're here for. We are running out of time. So, Anne, do you have any more audience questions that you want to ask?
Yeah, one more question that we have is, what are something you didn't expect about working in working in intelligence, and what is one of the biggest misconceptions you think about the job?
Okay. I was kind of prepared, as I said, when I was looking into going in at first, I had some conversations with older colleagues. Again, the one professor I was working for, who kind of disabused me of a lot of the myth, you know, the James Bond stuff, or better yet, the Americans, you know, more recently. As to what spies do, what intelligence is about, you know, how you do, and what it was. So I wasn't that much of a shock. But I think what I want to say is, I think there is the idea that this is, in some cases, a lot sexier than it is. Most of the work that's done on the intelligence side, and I think most of the good work, most of the best work, it's not boring, but it's hard work. It's working with the sources. It's working, you know, a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of discussion, a lot of meetings, many times, trying to come up, you know, with the kind of stuff that the policymaker is going to need and is going to want. It's not glamorous most of the time. It's not glorious most of the time. I think it's valuable, and I do find it rewarding. I mean, it's not to say also that, you know, there's some nice perks about it too. I was always, you know, very proud that I knew I had standing invitations in Tel Aviv and Brussels and elsewhere, and Oslo and Stockholm and Helsinki. Anytime I wanted to go visit, I could have an audience. But I usually sent my analysts instead, because by that time, I thought it was more important to get people out there that really knew something than necessarily me to go visit old friends. But anyway.
Thank you. And then we actually do have one more question from Christina Pedler. She asks, do you perceive that increasing anti-American sentiment as a result of President Trump's first term necessitates a graduate school degree and or experience from a foreign institution.
Could you just repeat that? I didn't quite get the last part of it.
Yeah, so do you perceive that increasing anti-American sentiment as a result of President Trump's first term necessitates a graduate school degree or experience from a foreign institution? And if you want to see the question, you can click the chat box and it should show up there for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, there's no denying that our standing and our position and our reputation has been hurt these last 4 years. There's just, you can't get around it. To deny it is denying reality. You only have to look at foreign polling. You only have to look at the, even this week, the concern that, you know, the Europeans and others have had about what's going on here in Washington. The question of our closest allies are sometimes even the hardest, you know, what's going on here. When you take aim at something like NATO, you know, an institution dear to my heart, and spent many weeks in Brussels at various meetings, and some of the more interesting and even fun work that I did. But not just NATO. You can look at the Japanese, the South Koreans, others. It's, you know, it's hurt, and there's going to have to be a rebuilding, and there's going to have to be a question. And the big question is, are we going to be able to do that kind of rebuilding? I think it's going to take time. I think there will be a sigh of relief if we have a new administration, but then the new administration is going to have to build on that. And as I said, it's going to take time. And for one reason, going back to an earlier question, is that we're going to have to be rebuilding some of our staff and some of our institutions and people that and how we can handle this. I think we can do it. In fact, I'm relatively confident we can do it. But it's going to have to be done. And that's where, you know, people like you, all of you out there, can kind of come into the picture. And it's where things like more education, looking at different programs. Have always been an education junkie. I was always many times, not always, but I mean, many times doing some kind of other training. I had sabbatical years in which I went back to university, whatever. And I always used to joke that I said they kept sending me to training because they foolishly thought I might eventually learn something. But I think that, so I come down on that side to begin with, that the education itself, in and of itself, is worth it. But I think it's also a way to advance both a career, but also a national interest. And I think that's important.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you everyone so much for attending and for your great questions. Thank you, Wayne, for talking directly to LMU students, taking the time out of your day. And a big thanks to Professor Park for all the work he does as GPI's director. If you liked this event, please follow us at LMU GPI on Instagram to find out about more events coming soon. And with that, I'll pass it on to Professor Park for some final words.
I really want to thank Dr. Limburg for coming and joining us today. You know, as I am now in year 9 of teaching at LMU, I came from the East Coast. I went to school on the East Coast, and I've come here, and we have so many great students here, Wayne, but a lot of them can't imagine going to DC and starting a career as a civil servant or maybe entering politics. DC is kind of a distant idea. So by coming here and talking about careers and how to get your foot in the door, I think we can bridge that gap a lot, because I think a lot of our students have a great passion for public service. And, you know, again, just a little bit of mentorship by coming back to your alma mater and talking with our students, I think can make a huge difference. And so I really want to say thank you. It sounds like it wasn't coincidental that you went to Georgetown first for graduate school, and then that kind of, you found a good mentor, and that kind of pushed you in the direction of your career. So we really appreciate that, because it's something we don't have, despite being the second largest city. I think we're pretty far removed from the policy world. So thank you so much.